Also guys, totally off topic, I watched Spider-Man No Way Home on premiere day. I have not felt that alive since Endgame. If you have not watched No Way Home, go watch it right. What are you doing? Also, to everyone who's now simping for Andrew Garfield, I just want you to know I was there first. Okay, I've been there since he was fan cast as Remus Lupin. I've been there, okay? Okay, that's all I want to say. Hey y'all, what's up? I'm Sabrina and welcome back to my book nook. Okay, so remember last video how I said I was like 90% sure I was gonna have an upload by next week? It ended up being like the 10% I did not. Point is, I actually have two very valid excuses though. Last week was midterms, so obviously could not upload then, and the week before that was preparing for midterms. I don't know why I thought it would be possible for me to somehow film and edit a video during these last 2 weeks. We're just gonna get straight to it today. You know, I don't really have much else to say. So today I'm gonna be doing a book review, or rather redoing a book review of a book I've already reviewed, but I'm doing it again. So today we're gonna be doing a review of These Violent Delights by Chloe Gong. So the reason I'm redoing this book review is because my original review of this book, I think I uploaded like back in July, and I was just having a really bad day when I read it and when I wrote the review. So when I read this book, I was kind of grumpy and I took it out on this book, which I regret a little bit because I reread this book after reading Our Violent Ends. I was like, hey, this is actually like not that bad as I remember. I don't know, I don't like the idea that there's this video of me with opinions that I don't hold anymore, especially if they're negative opinions about when I now have like positive opinions. I don't know, it's this whole thing. I don't really know why it causes me anxiety, it just does. So I'm redoing it. I'm redoing a book review, so yay. Anyways, so before I get into it, let me just break down how my book reviews work. My book reviews are broken down into 4 parts. Parts 1 and 4 will be spoiler free, but parts 2 and 3 will have spoilers. So if you don't want spoilers, you know, don't watch parts 2 and 3. Part 1, I give my beginning thoughts and opinions, just sort of like a beginning rambling and a brief plot summary. Part 2, I talk about plot writing and other elements, which is kind of self-explanatory. I talk about plot writing and other elements or aspects of the book I want to touch on. I give my praise, my criticisms here, and this is kind of where I do my most talking. Part 3, I talk about characters and relationships. Again, self-explanatory, I talk about characters and their relationships. And finally, part 4, final thoughts and opinions, as well as an overall rating and answering the question, is it a must-read? Okay, great. So without further ado, let's get into the video. Part 1, beginning thoughts and opinions. I think that this book definitely has one of the most interesting and at least captivating world building that I've read so far this past year. Like, the setting is really vibrant, it's loud, and it catches you in, and you're immediately thrown into this world where you're absolutely hooked. And the aesthetic is to die for. However, I will say the plot lacks a little bit. It's like one of those books that you can recognize based off of the vibes, based off the feelings, but when someone asks you to explain what the plot is, you're just kind of like, give me a moment, like give me a second, you know what I mean? Like, for example, The Raven Boys by Maggie Stiefvater, I can tell you like the vibes and the feeling and the aesthetic from that book, but I cannot for the life of me tell you anything that happens in this book. Also, I'm literally reading the second book of that series right now, and I can't tell you anything that's happening, but this is kind of the same thing with this book. You know, the vibes are amazing. Plot and writing is also pretty good, but I will say it's a bit iffy at times. I feel like it just could have been better. Also, the characters and relationships, I feel like they need a bit of work, but the potential is really, really there. and once you really connect with the characters, then it's very, very easy to fall in love with them and get invested in their relationships. So really quickly, let's just do a brief plot summary of this book. So These Violent Delights is a retelling of Romeo and Juliet set in 1920s Shanghai, China. It follows the kids of these two rival gangs, like the heirs and heiresses, I guess, of the gangs. You have Juliet Sai of the Scarlet Gang and Roma Montague of the White Flowers. Also, I looked up how to say Juliet's last name. It is Sai. Just a brief little promptu for any of you guys that didn't know how to pronounce her last name either. Anyways, both rival gangs start facing a very dangerous contamination / monster that's spreading throughout the cities and hurting both of their people, so they have to team up and fight the monster together. Ooh. Yeah, so moving on to part 2, thoughts on plot writing and other elements. Now, to begin with, I have to admit I am coming in with a bit of like a changed, little bit biased, very skewed perspective, because I have read the sequel, and so my view is obviously going to be a little bit different. I'm going to try to the best of my abilities to give an objective review of the book. However, I will say that the sequel is like, which is right here, the sequel is like pretty intertwined with the first book, and I think that both books are at their strongest when you read them as a duology and when you consider them as a duology. This review is for the first book and the first book only. So let me start by saying the writing has always been a point of like iffiness for me. While I do think that it was pretty standard, pretty good, I feel like some of the stylistic choices were either really bad or really good. I couldn't tell if I loved it or not, but I can tell you that it definitely got the job done. As for reading this book, I feel like you have to be in the right mindset to read it, which honestly is kind of advice for any book you read. You got to be in the right mindset to get in it. As for the concept of this book, it's obviously not very original, as it is one, a retelling of Romeo and Juliet, one of the most overdone stories in history probably, but also because it's the concept of set as rival gangs, which again is not that original, as there is the 1996 movie version of Romeo and Juliet as well as West Side Story. But I think that the setting is really what sets this story off, as well as the inclusion of this monster little subplot. And so while I wasn't the biggest fan of this monster subplot, I now understand why the author added it in, because, you know, if she didn't, then the story would just be another like Romeo and Juliet retelling, but as gangs, which there are already so many versions of. But with the monster aspect to the story, I just feel like it could have been done so much better. I feel like by calling it a monster in the first place, it already adds this sort of fantasy-esque aspect of it to the story, which I really didn't appreciate, because I feel like fantasy and the setting within this book don't really mix that well. I feel like if she sort of stuck to calling this like creature more of like scientific, very gritty, very more realistic sense of what a monster could be, it would have made more sense in the world within this story. But with the way that the monster was described and written, it just felt a little bit too like fantasy at some points, so I just did not like that. But I've grown to understand why she added in the monster in the first place, and it's not even a monster, so I don't know why I'm being so like nitpicky. But another thing that really sort of irked me a bit was the story did feel a bit rushed at certain points, or just the overall book itself was a little bit paced too fastly, I guess. Like, it is 400, that's all it is 400 pages long, and yet it still felt a little bit rushed somehow, which I think is just like, there's so much going on that you just sort of want to hone down and focus on just the very bare elements of the story, you know. And also for the ending, it was kind of predictable. Like throughout the entire book, they're like, who's controlling the monster? And then by the end, it's like, he is the monster. Like, who could have seen that coming? Y'all, everybody could have seen that coming. But one thing I actually did enjoy about this book was its discussion of colonization and these foreign countries coming into this country and taking advantage of their people and their resources. It was really refreshing to see that. And as for Romeo and Juliet's enemies to lovers sort of relationship, they're not enemies for the sake of being enemies, which a lot of YA books seem to do that now. They make the main characters enemies for the sake of being enemies to lovers so they can fit this trope without any real reasoning behind it. But with this book, they do have reasoning. They do have issues to sort out that aren't just, oh, she looked at me weird once. Like, I hate these new enemies to lovers books, you guys. I'm sorry, but they don't have any substance behind them now. But this one does. Their relationship does have substance. It discusses colonization. It discusses foreign countries taking advantage of this country and their people, and then now they have control over these people, which they should not have authority over. And while obviously some of the discussions and the conversations in this book about colonization aren't exactly like, you know, top tier political discussion, I do think that it was a very good base point to jump off of, especially given that it's a YA book. And also another thing I really loved was that since this book is set in China, it's really gratifying, I guess, as a Chinese person to see my culture finally being represented in a very popular YA book, I guess. I'll have like Chinese words in there, or like phrases or things that belong to Chinese culture, and I'll be like, hey, like, I know that. That's really, really nice to see. It's great to have representation. So moving on to part 3, characters and relationships. Starting off the main character, Juliet. I think Juliet was very relatable in the sense that she never really truly felt like she fit in either country. Like, she lived in America, she lived in China, but in America she was this Chinese girl, in China she was the American girl. And you know, as a Chinese American, I can obviously relate to that in some senses. So that one hit a little bit too close to home. Don't know why I jumped into a British accent there, but however, I do think that her character could have used some more work in the book, because while her struggles and basic characteristics were displayed throughout the book, I feel like they could have used more nuance. It was a little bit too 2D, and I feel like when you read this book and you're trying to connect to the characters, it takes a bit of work and takes a bit of effort, which is not something a lot of readers want to do, which is completely understandable. But I feel like once you actually do get to know the characters and get invested in them, it's really, really worthwhile, because I love all these characters now. It just took me a bit to connect with them. It takes a bit of work. So moving on to Roma, I feel like it was kind of the same with Roma. He was a little bit flat, a little bit 2D. I think the only time we really saw him come out was when he was with Juliet, which, speaking of the relationship, in this book, wow, you know, the relationship is goldmine. I am still emotionally devastated from it. But in this book, I feel like there was obviously a lot of chemistry and tension between them, but a little bit too much at some points, that it felt too forced. You know, I feel like with like this whole enemies to lovers, they hate each other thing, you gotta be careful with it. If you put too much in it, it either, one, feels like there's no chance of romance for them, or two, it feels too forced and a little bit too much like a Wattpad fanfiction. Overall, I feel like with a relationship, it is again something you have to actively try to connect with and push past a little bit of the writing, but I think it's really worthwhile because I do love them so much now. Also, really briefly, I just want to touch on Marshall, because usually I love this character type. You know, Marshall is supposed to be the pretty boy who hides behind sarcasm and funny jokes, but I feel like in this book he definitely fell flat a little bit, because there has to be substance behind, you know, the clown. For example, see Nikolai Lansoff or Kenji Kishimoto or Leo Valdez, some of my favorite characters of all time. But the reason they act this funny way is because they have some sort of baggage behind it. Like, they have a reason for acting this way. And with Marshall, you don't see that baggage, or you don't feel it. You know, it just feels forced. It feels a little bit corny. And I feel like that problem is definitely fixed in the second book, but in the first book only, not really so. I feel like Marshall is like a hit and a miss. Like, not a hit or miss, hit and miss. In the first book, a little bit of a miss. Second book, hit, hit, hit. Also, I love that the author made Marshall and Benedict a thing, because we all know that in the original Romeo and Juliet, Benvolio and Mercutio definitely had something going on, so kudos to the authors for putting that in this book, because we all knew there was something going on between the two of them. Okay, so moving on to part 4, final thoughts and opinions. So I think that the main takeaway from this book, honestly, is that you should read it as a duology. Same goes for this one. Read it as a duology. Read these two books together as a story. They're so strong and really just amazing. But we're not talking about duology here, we're talking about the first book. So with the first book, I definitely do think that the writing style can be a bit iffy, but the world is really like the main hook of this story. It's the thing that you love about this book. Personally, I really enjoyed the politics that were discussed in this book and the complexities behind Roma and Juliet's relationship and their backstories and their reasonings for being enemies. I think that was a really good touch added to the story. And while I don't necessarily enjoy the whole monster element added to the book, and I do feel like the story was definitely rushed at some points and had a bit of a pacing issue, I still think that the overall story was definitely something interesting. At least the characters and relationships definitely needed to be, I would say, a little bit more fleshed out, a little bit more well developed, and could have used a bit more work. But I feel like once you really do get invested in these characters and relationships, you get invested, like you really do connect with the characters. Overall, I think the story definitely had so much potential. It just tumbled a little bit on the execution, but that doesn't mean it's a bad story. I still very much enjoyed it. I just feel like it had a lot more potential it could have lived up to. But again, it is so much stronger if you read this book as a duology. If you keep the second book in consideration while you're reading the first book, it automatically makes this book like a million times better. Overall, I rated this book a 4.3 out of 5 stars. So, is this book a must read? I would say if, again, you kept the sequel in mind and read both of them as a duology, it is definitely a must read. But first book alone, I wouldn't say it's a must read, but if you already really want this book, definitely go ahead and get it. Or if you haven't heard of this book, keep it in mind, but I wouldn't actively put it on like number 1 of my want list, you know what I mean? Like, I would still read it, but it's not like you gotta have it right now. You just have to have it some point in the future. Yeah, but as for the duology, I would definitely put like number 1 on your list though. Yeah, anyways, I think that's all I wanted to talk about. If you watched this entire video, thank you so much for watching. If you like this video, give it a thumbs up. If you didn't, don't. If you hated it, give it a thumbs down. I don't really care. I mean, I do care, but you know, I don't care. Yeah, actually, I don't care. Again, thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time. Bye.